So the Rules Committee will come to order. So many people may, let's get right in. So many people may not realize it, but harmful so-called forever chemicals are found in many of the products we use every day, from food packaging to cookware to clothing, even firefighting foam. They pollute our drinking water, they harm our environment, and they threaten public health. But right now, they are not designated as harmful chemicals, which they are. That's why we're considering H.R. 535 today. This bill directs the EPA to designate forever chemicals as hazardous substances to better protect our drinking water and to lessen the risks to our first responders. So having said that, I'm happy to turn now to our ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any remarks he wishes to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Our single item today is H.R. 535, the PFAS Action Act of 2019. H.R. 535 is a bill that could and should have been bipartisan. It attempts to address a problem, contamination, and environmental damage caused by two groups of manufactured chemicals that everyone in both parties agrees is a problem. But instead of proceeding on a bipartisan basis, the majorities decided to move forward with a partisan bill that stands no chance of becoming law. During the markup at the Energy and Commerce Committee, Republicans proposed bipartisan compromise language to address this problem that's already passed the Senate and could head to the president's desk today. But unfortunately, the majorities rejected that compromise. It's a shame and unfortunately indicative of how the majority's chosen to operate since taking control of the House. At the beginning of the 116th Congress, we in the minority were promised more openness, more inclusiveness, and more bipartisanship. But instead, we've seen bipartisan bills turned into partisan ones, simply to make political points. We've yet to have a single open rule throughout, despite promises to the contrary, and we've seen vastly more Democratic amendments made in order than Republican or bipartisan ones. I remind my colleagues that this was not the case when Republicans were in the majority. In fact, Republicans in the last Congress made more Democratic amendments in order than those proposed by our own side. Mr. Chairman, at some point, the majority must decide whether they are here to make political points or to make law. Today's bill is indicative of the approach the majority's chosen thus far, to make political point instead of passing a bill that can actually become law. I would strongly urge the majority to reconsider this direction and choose instead to move forward with more bipartisanship, more openness, and a greater effort to actually govern. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much, and I thank you for your opening statement. I now want to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony in H.R. 535, the PFAS Action Act. Chairman Pallone and Mr. Shimkus, we're delighted that you're here. Anything you brought in writing will, without objection, be entered into the record. So I now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Chairman Pallone, for any opening statement he wishes to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll try to summarize my statement. And just in response to Mr. Cole, let me just say that if there was any way to achieve a bipartisan consensus with Mr. Shimkus, it would have happened because we get along quite well. And he's making me laugh. I got to become serious here now because this is such a serious issue. But in any case, I'm proud to be here today to support the PFAS Action Act of 2019. It's a comprehensive package of strategies to regulate PFAS chemicals, clean up contamination, and protect public health. I'm not going to get into the details of what PFAS is, but it's a very persistent chemical in the environment and an urgent threat to public health. Unfortunately, this administration is failing impacted communities, and so Congress must act. If I thought that the EPA could do this or would do this, I wouldn't be here today. The inaction by the EPA has basically meant that PFAS contamination has spread across the country. You might say, is this something new? Well, it really isn't. We know about the harms of PFAS since as early as the 1950s, particularly at defense sites, because it was used quite often as defense sites in the foam that was used to fight fires. But even so, even though EPA has known about the harm for decades, we still have no protections from PFAS in drinking water, no limits on air emissions, no cleanup requirements, no limits on dumping into our waterways, and no restrictions on PFAS disposal or use. We don't even have a labeling of PFAS ingredients to allow consumers to protect themselves from it. And the problem is that the longer we delay, the worse the problem becomes. It spreads, and it becomes even more of a health problem. So that's why I think it's important to pass legislation. Now, I should mention that this package really is a comprehensive package that includes the work of about a dozen Democratic members and several Republicans as well, all who've seen impacts from PFAS in their district. As I go through this and talk about briefly what's in this bill, I'll mention the various sponsors. So there's a bipartisan provision originally authored by Representatives Dingell and Upton that requires cleanups of PFAS contamination under the Federal Superfund program. And this is a critical component of the legislation. And the Manager's Amendment also makes some changes, but mostly technical to this. Then the second thing is the bills on legislation from Representative Sean Patrick Maloney to require health effects and testing of PFAS chemicals in terms of the health impact. Then there's a moratorium on new PFAS until EPA has the science it needs to properly evaluate them. And this was put in by Representative Custer, a member of our committee. Another part of the bill, bills on bipartisan legislation from Representatives Boyle and Fitzpatrick to set a national drinking water standard that protects public health, including the health of pregnant women, infants, and children. And then there's a provision that I introduced to provide financial assistance to water utilities struggling to remove PFAS from drinking water. Those treatment techniques are very expensive and often beyond what's affordable for many communities. The legislation also addresses air emissions of PFAS, incorporating legislation from Representative Stevens to address emissions under the Clean Air Act, and legislation from Representatives Khanna and Levin to restrict unsafe incineration of PFAS. And then the bill includes a provision by Representative Soto to create a voluntary PFAS-free label for cookware so consumers can take steps to protect themselves from exposure. And lastly, the bill includes a provision by Representative Fletcher that requires EPA to issue guidance for first responders to minimize the use of PFAS in firefighting foam, which I mentioned before, and turnout gear, and also minimize their risk. We heard from the International Association of Firefighters at one of our hearings how these chemicals are affecting their health. Now, the Manager's Amendment mainly strikes the part of the bill that was included in the NDAA. We did actually come to a consensus on some of the provisions, and they were included in the NDAA, and I wanted to mention Representatives Dean Delgado and Slotkin for their work on those sections and congratulate them on the enactment. So again, this is a comprehensive package. Many people have been involved, mostly Democrats, but also some Republicans, and I would urge the committee to pass it and also pass out the Manager's Amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm happy to be here with my chairman, Frank Pallone. We are good friends. This just shows you that you can agree to disagree without being disagreeable, and I appreciate his friendship. First of all, let me just say, when you hear the term PFAS, it's easy to say PFAS as it's one chemical, one element, one formula. PFAS is a class of chemicals. In fact, we don't even know how many there are in this class. We used the number 5,000 in our debate. I think EPA has a list of 7,800. We do know there is concern on two, which is PFOA and PFAS, but this is a family of chemicals. It's like saying ban all fruit because oranges are bad. So our objection to this whole debate is that we are going to politically ban a class of chemicals, 5,000 to 7,800 chemicals, without knowing whether they're dangerous. And we're going to do it politically. And this will be the first time in 40 years. We've never done this. Our government has never politically banned a chemical. It has done it through the scientific method and the process, through due diligence, research, and a determination of the health effects. Frank and I are good friends, and he lectured me numerous times about if you want to get a bill to become a law, you got to work together. And if it's just a messaging bill, which this is, because we did have some action in the NDAA, we had some action in the omnibus bill. There are a few things that we would like to have had included in that also at the end, and it just didn't happen. Per and polyfluorinated compounds, again, 5,000 of them, 7,800 of them, are in almost every aspect of our lives today. And I have this one. A lot of us flew here today. So when they close the door on the airplane, this is a seal that keeps the door and your compartment pressurized. And whether it's our military who uses Gore-Tex to keep them dry, or as I'll talk about on the floor, the wiring harnesses for F-16 planes, per and polyfluorinated compounds are throughout the existence in our society today. So our concern with this is, first of all, it doesn't do due diligence to see what is actually hazardous. And two, it may pull out two, PFOA and PFOS, but if there's 5,000 compounds, what about the other 4,998? Are they all hazardous? It's taken EPA over 20 years just to start determining whether PFOA and PFOS are bad. This bill also takes 5 years and says, in 5 years, EPA, you have to get a determination of all the rest of these 5,000 compounds. EPA hasn't been able to do 2 in 20 years. How in the world are they going to do 5,000 in 5 years? This bill has a lot of problems and a lot of challenges. We wish that we could have worked together. We obviously couldn't. I will just end with this, and there's talking points, but obviously I'm not using them. Is that we want to move on identifying the hazardous chemicals and doing remediation and cleaning them up. But without knowing exactly if it's a chemical is hazardous, and then adding over 5,000 more that you haven't even started to study, is more messaging than policy. And that's why we will work hard to either amend the bill where it's more acceptable on the floor, which is in your court, at least allowing that to happen, or we'll have to vote against it on the floor. And with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate both of you being here. And let me just say, this is a big issue back in my district. My firefighters talk to me about this all the time. Widows of firefighters who have died of cancer talk to me about this issue all the time. And I don't have the same confidence, Mr. Shimkus, that you do in EPA at this particular, especially this EPA. I mean, we read about how science panels are being gutted, how science is being put aside on behalf of special interests. So to be honest with you, I just don't have a lot of confidence that left to their own devices that this EPA is going to do anything that is in the, quite frankly, the interest of the health and well-being of citizens over special interests and profits. I mean, I'm sad to say that, but I think it's something that I've come to conclude. And by the way, we read about this every day, almost every day in the news media. So, you know, I mean, I think we'll have a vigorous debate on this. Hopefully, there'll be some amendments made in order. We'll battle this, Mr. Pallone. You want to respond?
Well, I just wanted to mention that, you know, when I talked about a moratorium on PFAS, it's on new PFAS. So it would be on those chemicals that have not been used or identified, not the ones that already are. And that's because of the concern over the science until that science is developed. It's not a ban on the PFAS that's being used now.
I appreciate it.
If I can just respond to that issue, it's a ban on new PFAS that might be safer and might be more helpful in addressing these concerns. So that's our concern, is you're taking the next generation. And we know greener technology is greener technology. Science and industry are moving to safer chemicals. So when you ban it, you're banning the opportunity for safer chemicals to come on the market.
Yeah, I mean, and we're dealing with an administration that doesn't even believe in the science that there's such a thing as climate change. It's just hard for me to believe that, that they're going to do the right thing on this particular issue. But anyway, we'll have this debate, and I have no questions. Mr. Hastings?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I echo your sentiments, and I ask unanimous consent that a letter in support of this legislation from the American Association for Justice be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. I don't have any questions, but I have great concerns, and both parties, Mr. Pallone and Mr. Shimkus, I know to be true to course when it comes to trying to work together. I don't agree that this is just a messaging bill. And one of the disturbing features of our legislative process in the last year has been the 400 measures plus that have been sent to the United States Senate. Many of them have not even been debated. Now, to say that this legislation is dead on arrival at the United States Senate would be just to add to all of those that have already gone before it or that die in the Senate. I would like to see, for example, once we pass, if we do, this legislation, the Senate take it up and debate it, and then do what we would normally do under regular order, go to conference, and all of the issues that you all are talking about likely could be resolved. We all know it to be a very dangerous problem that needs addressing, and toward that end, it would be my hope that the Senate would do its job after we've done ours, regardless of whether or not this is favorable legislation to either Democrats or Republicans. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
And I just want to, thank you, and I just want to, just for the record, I mentioned that there are people in my district. There's a woman in particular, Diane Cotter, from my district, whose husband was a firefighter, who believes that, who died of cancer, and, and it is believed that it is related to the chemicals in his gear that he wore. She has been relentless in kind of taking up his cause and warning of this for years. And again, as a lot of you know, in the defense authorization bill, there were lots of amendments on PFAS that were passed in a bipartisan way. Unfortunately, many of them got stripped in the conference committee because the Senate wouldn't agree to it. But this is an issue that I know there's bipartisan concern on. And in any event, I thank you, Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I ask my questions, I'd ask unanimous consent to submit for the record the statement of administration policy, which says if H.R. 535 would arrive at the President's desk as currently written, his advisors would recommend a veto.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Shimkus, in your dissenting views in the committee report, you said that H.R. 535 mandates multiple aggressive actions, such as a mandate of certain PFAS as hazardous substance under CERCLA. Has Congress ever statutorily mandated a substance designation before?
No, never.
You think we should begin doing that today?
For my friends who believe in science, and we've talked about the science of climate change, if you believe in science in that debate, you got to believe in science in this debate, and you should let science and toxicology drive this issue of what's safe and what. And the only problem, the issue is it's not just two chemicals. It's just not the chemicals that are in firefighting foam. This does 5,000 chemicals or permutations, 7,800 of them. So definitely not.
Mr. Shimkus, in addition to the rulemaking process already in place under CERCLA, EPA, and this administration, they have a plan to protect our nation's drinking water and help affected communities better monitor, detect, and address PFAS. Shouldn't we let the regulators do their jobs rather than have Congress take the unusual step of statutorily mandating a substance designation?
Absolutely.
And you said in your testimony, so I want to be clear and confirm my understanding, that over a dozen PFAS provisions were enacted into law through the NDAA and the FY 2020 appropriations, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and given that, in addition to what steps the EPA is already taking, do you see any need for this legislation at all right now?
I mean, the legislation proposed in this bill is broad. It takes in a wide swath. Chairman Pallone and I have worked on the drinking water standards and trying to aid local water companies or municipal water systems to be able to address that issue and clean. So in the full picture of this bill, it's too big, it's too unwieldy, no. I do think there are provisions that we can work on.
Well, with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back, but I can't yield back without saying, I wish my friend would stick around another term, keep working with my good friend and your good friend, the chairman, on this issue.
Chemicals are just too fun to deal with, so
I'll
Just-
certainly
just-
join you in saying you should stay
See,
here.
here you go, a bipartisan consensus between the chairman and myself. With that,
And I'll join with that. I mean, Mr.
We
Shimkus
tried to
and
get
I
him to change
got
his
elected
mind.
the same year to get with the same class.
not as
together.
hard as we did.
We came into the same class together, so I hate to see him go.
neighbors on the
He's going to
fifth
be
floor.
very missed because, again, whatever our disagreements on this legislation, Mr. Chairman, I know we all value Mr. Shimkus' bipartisanship and his hard work on committee. He's going to be missed a
He's a
lot.
good guy.
He's a very good guy.
Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for coming before our committee today. You know, in a preliminary study, approximately 300 drinking wells in California were found to contain traces of PFAS. 300. Now, these are toxic forever chemicals, forever. This includes a recently active drinking water well in my district, in the city of Ontario, a well that was serving over 100,000 people. 100,000 people. In neighboring cities, in Los Angeles, Riverside, and San Bernardino counties, where my constituents work and live and play, there are active wells also that have been contaminated by PFAS. PFAS has been connected to increased rates of cancer, lower fertility, delayed development in children. So more and more, our constituents are becoming allergic to food that they have eaten for years. And I don't think that we can continue to allow the failure of the EPA to get in the way of addressing this very important issue. A lot of the contamination is connected to military sites and the Defense Department. So it's our military folks that are paying the highest price for these chemicals. An LA Times report found that California had 21 contaminated military bases. That's more than any other state. 6 of these bases, chemicals leached into external drinking water systems. So we can't even contain it. It's been leaching into the water wells. Now, you know, in California, we have this fight over water. And it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat. We don't fight those battles because we're Republicans or we're Democrats. Those are territorial battles over water. We have a lot of water in my district. Unfortunately, much of that has been contaminated. Where contractors have come in and utilized cheap land and left it abandoned, and now the community is stuck with it. So I want to thank you, Chairman Pallone, for your leadership in this and ensuring that we continue to have this dialogue and that I hope that this bill goes through. I want to encourage all my colleagues to support it, but I hope that we can do more than that, and that is to bring the Senate to actually perform their duties and begin to protect our communities from these types of chemical contaminants. And with that, I'll
Could I
yield
just
back.
ask you to yield?
Please.
I'll try to be brief. I just wanted to say, what you're really pointing out, the reason we have to act now and that we can't wait for the EPA, which really hasn't done any of these things, is because of the spreading, right? In other words, this is rapidly spreading through, various sources, air, ground, drinking water supply. So the longer you wait, the worse it's going to get, and the more difficult and expensive it's going to be to clean it up. So that's my first point and your point. And the second thing, going back to Mr. Cole, the reason I don't think this is just a message vehicle is because if you look at what happened with the NDAA, and really, I'm not an advocate for doing energy and commerce issues on the NDAA bill, but a lot of this was at military bases, so that's why it happened. We started out where, there was a lot of opposition to some of these things, and we did make some progress, and, even though some of the senators and some of the Republicans say, no, we're not doing this, eventually we did end up with certain things, and I think we almost, got even a little further. So what I'm saying is, you can negotiate before you send something out of committee, before it passes the House, or after it passes the House. And I do believe that the time now is that we've made some progress, but now it's a good thing to pass this bill, and then we go back and negotiate some of these provisions with the Senate. So I don't want you to think that this is just a message vehicle. I think that what we did in the last few months clearly shows that it's not, and that there is support for maybe not the whole package, but some part of it. So I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you. Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Balone, you started by saying, hey, if there'd been a bipartisan compromise to be found, the two of you all would have found it. I take you at your word. When we were talking about prescription drugs, you said something very similar, and at the end of the day, it was we believe in negotiation. We call that price fixing in that context, but we have our way that we want to do it. Republicans don't want to do it that way, and so there was no common ground to be found. I'm looking at a Shimkus amendment that was submitted that said, I recognize the urgency of what's going on, and we need to have immediate work on PFOA and PFOS, that we need to have drinking water standards set in an expedited way, that Congress cannot wait for EPA, that we must move forward together. I imagine you support that language. What is the wisdom on something that we're using fairly dire health terms here, folks dying of cancer, children's development being affected? What is the wisdom of not accepting partnership language like that Mr. Shimkus has offered and that you support, and moving that to the Senate and hopefully to the President's desk, and then coming back and doing this broader work that Democrats on the committee would also like to do?
Are you talking about the drinking water standard?
I am.
I'm not sure that I'm answering your question, but let me just say what happened with the NDAA. We had, with the NDAA, we wanted to have a standard that was made into law that was at least as strong as what the health advisory that the EPA uses right now, because the health advisory is a standard that a lot of states use. And the concern was that if you just had an open-ended, you develop a drinking water standard, which is what the Senate Republicans wanted, that would actually be worse, because we do have a health advisory now that's actually being used by many states and by others. And so the fear was, if you just have, say, set up a standard, but it doesn't at least meet the health advisory that's already out there, then you actually may end up with a weaker standard. I'm sure that answers your question, but that was the debate in the NDA, and that's why it never happened.
Well, I'm sure you all talked about it in committee, and Mr. Shimkus may be able to speak to it more. Again, the Shimkus language that I'm looking at is an amendment to the rule. It's amendment number 39.
This is about vulnerable populations. Okay.
This is the one that says,
Yes.
let's begin cleanup on PFOA today. Let's not delay. Let's begin cleanup on PFOS today. Let's not delay. Let's do focus on those DOD facilities. Let's do mandate EPA primary drinking water regs, and let's expedite those regs. We could have done something together. When you say that their bipartisan solution couldn't be found, I just want to understand if that's because somebody wants to clean up toxic chemicals and somebody doesn't, or because there are toxic chemicals we all want to clean up, but the committee in its wisdom just didn't want to move that language. It wanted to move something broader.
Well, again, there's two things. My staff just reminded me another aspect. You know, going back to what I said before about the NDA discussion, I guess my problem is that I didn't believe that if we just said to EPA, establish a standard, that they would necessarily come up with a good standard, because frankly, they haven't. I mean, I'm trying to be good here today, but if anything, the Trump administration has been characterized by weakening standards rather than providing strong standards. So there was what I said before, not meeting the health advisory. But then there was also mixed in with that, and this is where I think you're talking about, Mr. Shimkus, is that we wanted a standard that said that, vulnerable populations, which would be pregnant women, infants, and children would be adequately protected, because a lot of the problem has been that those vulnerable populations are particularly negatively impacted by PFAS. But again, there were times when it seemed like we were close, but we just didn't get there, and I still think we can get there. But I think, we've done as much as we can. At this point, we should pass this bill, which covers a lot of these areas, and then we see what we can do with the Senate. I don't know what else to say. I'm repeating myself.
Mr. Shimkus, is there any merit to there was a great deal that we could have done that would have meant a lot to a lot of communities right away, that we could have collaborated on in a bipartisan way and not received a veto message from the president?
Yeah, as you know, legislating is an art, it's not a science, and it's done through different means, some through the authorization committee, some through the appropriations committee, and authorizers don't like it when appropriators authorize, and that was our committee's kind of opposition to what was going on with the NDA until there was three sides of the debate that pretty much agreed to do something and do this, X. And that there was one corner that didn't. They still got some of that done, but the safe drinking water aspect was left on the shelf and wasn't rolled into the NDAA, and so we lost that battle, and it's brought back here again. Safe Drinking Water Act is under our jurisdiction. It's under my subcommittee's jurisdiction, and there's a key provision of that, which is, can the local, rural, small-town municipal water systems afford to do this, right? And so the whole question is testing of chemicals that you don't even know how to test, because we don't know how to test these yet. We haven't even developed a testing system for 4,998 of these. So how do you test for it to begin with? Then you don't know you don't have a system to clean it. You may be able to do PFOA and PFOS, but how do you even clean up the other 4,998 in 5 years? I mean, so this bill is aspirational. It's kind of like, if we could do this in a perfect world, it'd be great. But the reality is we can't. And so we're trying to bring a semblance of what can we do, and that's where we fell upon this.
I thank the chairman and the ranking member for being here. I yield back, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Promoter.
Thank you, and gentlemen, thanks for your testimony today. I'd say to my friend, Mr. Shimkus, that when you make a generalization, sometimes it comes back to haunt you. And you said, we've never outlawed a compound ever without some scientific study. Well, I can tell you, your state, 6 days ago, or 7 days ago, said, we're not outlawing THC anymore. Okay? So that was done by edict 50-plus years ago, without any study, and all the compounds related to THC, whether it was hemp or cannabis or marijuana, just done. And it became, under your committee's jurisdiction, a controlled one, or a class 1 controlled substance, illegal for all purposes. Forget about just cleaning up. It was just illegal, period. You can't even test it. So generalizations, and your Your main point, though, I appreciate, whether it's Gore-Tex or Teflon or these things which initially are very beneficial to us in the way we live our lives, but ultimately they're, and I don't know, whether Teflon or Gore-Tex or any of these have created problems, but they are chemicals, they are things that really are beneficial, but ultimately in some instances become problematic. And I can tell you in Colorado, we have certainly Air Force and Army bases that have some terrible problems and are costing the communities fortunes, regardless of setting standards under the Clean Drinking Water Act, or Safe Drinking Water Act. So I guess I just have a really sort of general question for both of you, and then I want to get back to the real nub of the problem here. So we've got 10 or 11 bills that were combined to come up with this particular legislation. Are all 10 or 11 in controversial, or were 9 out of 10 okay, and there's one section that just really is problematic? That's my question to the two of you.
If I can jump in first, in the 10 to 12 provisions of bills, I think we were comfortable with probably 4, and we were going to move a little bit further than I would have ever wanted to move. But then we had this incineration issue and the Clean Air Act and a writ large Superfund problem across the board for every chemical and any operation. I also had a farmland issue with in water plants and the sludge, and they get thrown on for fertilizer or agricultural land. And I was concerned about that being automatically deemed a Superfund site in the agricultural community. So there was a lot of reasons why we couldn't get there. We did make a great effort. I will agree with the chairman, and we just couldn't get there.
Mr. Pallone?
I mean, I could add to that, but I think he's essentially said what's true, so.
Okay, so my next question is, just listening to Mr. Shimkus, we've got two, PFOS and PFOA, whatever it is. Those seem to be sort of key chemicals. There are 4,998 or more other kinds of compounds. So, Mr. Pallone, just help educate me on the bill. Does it ban all these compounds?
No, nothing that, the moratorium is strictly for new PFAS, right? Things that have not been in use. The
Okay.
two that, I think that Mr. Shimkus has mentioned, these are the ones that are part of the cleanup, the Superfund cleanup. And again, I'm not trying to prolong the debate here, but, that the two areas that are the most important, one is the cleanup and what kind of a standard we put it under Superfund, right? And the other is the drinking water standard, which I think we've had quite a bit of discussion. And those are the two that, again, in the NDAA bill, the Senate didn't want to deal with the cleanup at all, the Senate Republicans. And then the drinking water standard, I basically related what I thought happened there. But, there's a lot of other things in here, the testing, the cookware, the labeling, air emissions. It's not just those two. But I don't want,
So, gentlemen, just stop for a second, all right?
Yes,
You two have been living with this thing
and we will
constantly,
continue to, yes.
okay? We haven't.
No.
So when we ask these questions, you may have had to say this 1,000 times in your committees.
Oh, no, I don't mean it that way.
No, but, so really, I'm not trying to be dumb or prolong the debate, but I really want to understand what the issue is. If they're not being banned, it's on a going forward basis, we're saying, hey, chemicals with these compounds, we want to know what their effect may be before we allow more
Well, the problem
to
is
be
that-
out in the atmosphere or in the water.
Well, the problem is that the PFAS that's already out there on the market, right? Like, he's showing you that. He had me touch it before. I told him I would. I know it's not funny, but whatever. It is funny, though. But what I was going to say, I know. What I was going to say is that the stuff that's been out there has been harm, and we've known about the harm, particularly at the defense facilities, since the 50s, right?
Right.
And so the problem is, we have no, standard for drinking water protections. We have no limits on air emissions. We have no cleanup requirements, no limits on dumping, no restrictions on disposal. So for the stuff that's out there, we want to do all these things. For the stuff that hasn't been developed and it is not in use, we want to put a moratorium until there's better science. Does that explain?
I mean, yes, and that seems reasonable to me, and I would say to my friend, Mr. Shimkus, just thinking about a couple of these bases that we have in Colorado, and it really is firefighting foam that seems to be really a stickler here. It is, so the water systems have been completely shut down.
So that's PFOS.
Okay,
That's PFOS.
right? And that's, so
So
to your
that,
point is, we should be focusing on that or
Correct.
the PFOA, and we don't need to worry about the 4,998
Well, and
other.
then you have, the real issue is you have stuff like this that then gets incinerated, and we got a municipal generator that incinerates trash across the Potomac. You get air emissions, and then there's a de facto ban on any current use of any of those other 5,000 permutations because of the Superfund concern and the incineration. We tried to address incineration.
Just for, I'll just try to summarize it for myself. On a going forward basis, on new things, there's a moratorium until we understand the stuff better. On a going backwards, looking backwards basis, this is going to be very expensive to clean things up, and we really don't know how to clean it up, is kind of what I'm hearing you say, Mr.
It can be
Shimkus.
cleaned up, but it's very expensive. That's why we also have a grant program in here, too.
Okay. I mean, I just don't see how this is really so problematic, this, we got to do it. On a going, the stuff that's already out there, and on a going forward basis, we're just trying to be a little more educated before we allow these things because they don't break down.
I would, respectfully, I would just say, we do not know of the 5,000 chemicals which are hazardous and which are not. We
Except
don't know.
for the two.
We have pretty good certainty on the two.
Okay. I thank the chairman for indulging me. I yield back.
Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Having been through some of this in markup in the full committee, I mean, it strikes me the problematic part of 535 is Section 2 and that automatic designation that occurs under Section 2, automatically designating the PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances under the Superfund law that is outside of the regular rulemaking process. So there are 800 things that have been designated as hazardous under the Superfund law, but those went through a process. Do I recall that correctly?
Well, when the Superfund was first established, there were certain things that were listed. But since then, the process has been what you described.
So is the worry that the EPA is not already actively evaluating and investigating these products, that they have to be designated upon the signing of this bill, and that we can't allow what has been the process for the other 800 substances that have been identified, we can't allow that process to continue?
Yes, because there's no reason to believe, and again, this now is going to sound political, that this administration is going to do it based on what they've been doing.
Well, you may have identified what your problem is, but Mr. Shimkus, do you have a thought on that?
Well, I'll just be brutally honest. We were close to joining with our Democrats on these two chemicals. There was just a lot of other problems that we couldn't agree to. That was a stretch for us because we would rather use science and do the scientific process and do due diligence. You're safer that way. You get stakeholder input. You can bring other science to the matter. And EPA, listen, the problem with this whole bill, not the bill, but this whole issue is that communities are concerned, they want action, and they want action faster than the scientific process will allow us to evaluate these chemicals. And I get it. You think I like being up here trying to defend forever chemicals? No. But I'd rather want to make sure that they're bad than just ban a whole class of chemicals.
Well, you're the one who brought the piece of it
Yeah,
and
wanna
exposed the
hold-
rest
you
of
can
us.
hold it too.
right.
You
That's
can
right.
hold the mic too if you want. If I could just say, look, obviously listing it guarantees it. I don't have a lot of faith, obviously, in the EPA under this administration using and going through this scientific process properly because the president, continually denies science. But there's also, obviously, you could come to some sort of compromise, but we weren't able to do that.
Well, if I may, what is it, am I correct to say there are 8,000 compounds that would fall into this PFAS category?
That's the other issue. We really don't know. That's the sad thing. We were using 5,000 in the committee debate. We think EPA has a listing of 7,800 of them that we were going to use in our debate today, but I didn't want people to say, well, you said 5,000 last week. Now you're saying 7,800. How do you ban a class of chemicals you don't even know how many are in there?
And the current number of substances banned under the CERCLA law is 800. So this is 10 times the amount that is currently.
With the requirement to evaluate the whole class in 5 years.
And correct. I just, how was that going to work?
It's not going to happen.
Mr. Chairman, I do think it's important that we acknowledge that by my count, there are 15 provisions dealing with the PFAS issue that were included in the NDAA, 2 that were included in the fiscal year appropriations that passed last month. And these are varied and significant. One is requiring the EPA to mandate that drinking water systems monitor for unregulated PFAS. This means that 29 PFAS chemicals will be monitored during the 5th unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. Provides grants to communities to address emerging contaminants. Requires new reporting of PFAS under the TSCA program. Requires manufacturers and processors of PFAS to submit the health and safety information that they do have to the EPA. Requires the EPA to complete a rule under the Toxic Substance Control Act to place restrictions on new uses of long-chain PFAS. Requires the EPA to issue guidance for appropriate destruction and disposal of PFAS. Requires the Department of Defense to submit to Congress a remediation plan for cleanup of water that is contaminated with PFOA and PFOS. Phases out the use of PFAS in meals ready to eat, which actually sounds like a good idea. So, I mean, these are significant agreements that occurred in the conference committee at the NDAA. So it's not like there's not a desire to get this problem solved. I think there is. The difficulty is that if you create something that actually either can't become law or is unworkable if it does become law, we're actually going to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. When it comes time for the amendment process, I will have some comments on an amendment or two, but at this point, I'll yield back to the chairman.
Terrific. Ms. Scanlon?
Yeah, thank you. PFAS has been a big issue in the region where I come from, southeast Pennsylvania. Madeline Dean in the adjoining district has a significant contamination site there. I think we have 17 PFAS contamination sites in the state. My district has the only regional trash burning plant, so it's, all around us. So there's a significant amount of interest in lighting a fire under the EPA to actually do something here. The state's been struggling to, in the wake of the EPA, noticing there's a problem, but declining to actually set the standards. The individual states are having to do this. So I think we do need to light a fire under the EPA and would like to move forward with that. Thank you.
Ms. Lesko?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a 4-hour flight coming here today, and in that I was so happy to read all about this on the plane. And so I don't have any questions, but, just an observation. I don't think we're going to be really surprised that the vote is going to be 9-4 here today, and you guys are in the majority, so you can pass this out of rules, you can pass it out of the floor, but then what's the good of it? It's not going to get signed into law. So if you really want to get something done, I suggest we continue to work with each other, and that's it. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the Chair and Ranking Member for being here. This is a fascinating subject, and I think it sort of falls down around what premise do you start with and what's the default about what you want to do. So of the 5,000, 7,000 substances that are PFAS, how many have been determined by EPA to be safe and not cause damage to human beings, water systems, et cetera?
I don't think any of them have been determined to be safe, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
Or the contrary is, most of them have not been determined to be harmful.
So, you know, I think about this, I think it's an important question in the modern world where we are more and more sensitive every day to the impacts on the environment and to the planet for human activity. And I recognize that new materials do help us in modern life, whether it's telecommunications, cell phones, all the things that we rely on that require all kinds of material sciences and new products and new materials being developed, lightweight aircraft, et cetera. I mean, it's really, you know, I think for lay people, mind-boggling, the amount of chemicals and materials that we can produce now. And it occurs to me as we're having this discussion and, you know, as we have a debate, not only in the United States, but around the world, is, so what do we do about this? We don't know what the long-term impacts potentially are, and then so where do you fall? You know, my dad was a pipe fitter. He did pneumatic controls. Pneumatic controls, for those of you who don't know, young people, everything's electronic, but in the old days, you'd use hydraulics to make calls on heat or air conditioning to come to heat buildings or cool buildings. And for years, he worked with asbestos in powdered form. And unfortunately, when he died 4 years ago, what we know is he had asbestosis. So my mom gets, you know, checks periodically from manufacturers who knew that asbestos was harmful to human beings, but did nothing about it until they ended up creating, by act, I'm sure, of Congress, to create funds to help widows and widowers whose family members were deceased because of the impacts of these chemicals. I think of products like Freon, which my father also worked with, which are now, in some cases, and I think 2020 is the last year you can use certain types of Freon. So, you know, it occurs to me when you have questions like this, and I appreciate comments made about the EPA and let them do their work. I must admit to you, in the face of all the evidence by the scientific community around climate change, when you have the leader of the executive branch of the United States who denies climate change, I don't know how much more scientific evidence one could possibly need to suggest that climate change is not only real, but impacted by human activity. I mean, the evidence is overwhelming. I remember several years ago talking to a friend, Bill Dessler, who at the time was president of the Rochester Institute of Technology, and he said there may be still a public debate among politicians about climate change, but there's no debate any longer in the scientific community. It's compelling, it's overwhelming evidence, and so it's hard for me to place trust in the EPA or the administration when they deny something so obvious and so apparent and so now accepted by the scientific community worldwide. So I think it comes back to me, and I didn't see, and I don't know the answer to this, so I hate to ask questions that I don't know the answers to, but I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not burdened by that. I noticed manufacture was banned. I did not see the word research being banned. Is there a ban on research on PFAS?
No, there's no ban on research.
So new chemicals could be produced in a laboratory, and then, I recognize that the EPA doesn't give clean bills of health until I guess the default is that something's okay until it's proven not to be. But it doesn't seem to me that this bill necessarily stops innovation. Yeah, sure, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, let me, and just for the debate, to think that maybe Congress hasn't addressed this issue at all. We did pass a revamped Toxic Substance Control Act, bipartisan bill.
It took us 14 years.
Took me 5.5.
We did.
And President Obama signed it. The premise of that was when new chemicals come to the market, we should get them reviewed before they go into commercial use. The difficulty of the EPA and this whole world of addressing these chemicals is that they started doing this work when you have all these bazillion chemicals out there already. So reviewing the existing chemical population is as you can say, we got 820, well, now 40 years probably, it's 1980. So that, we're trying to catch up. We tried to reform TSCA to do that. We know we're way behind, but the committee has tried to work.
No, and I fully appreciate it, and I recognize that there are limits to what the EPA can do in terms of the amount of people they have and the workforce they have to be able to do it, and that the impacts of some of these chemicals on human health or our ecology and the environment may be several years in the making. So I go back, I guess, in my mind to where the default is. Do you start by just assuming that they're okay, even though I don't think there's any demonstrable evidence that there's any PFAS that's safe? And given that these are chemicals that do not easily break down, as I understand, in terms of the chemistry of them, it does seem to me, and whether this is the final version or whether something is ultimately negotiated between the Senate and the White House, but I do think this is a pressing issue, it's an important issue. I think this is a good first step, and if there ultimately is a compromise that gets us somewhere, I would welcome that. But right now, I think given what we know about the science, what we know about, frankly, my mistrust, I hate to say it, of the president who's denied climate change despite the overwhelming abundance of evidence, I do think that this is the appropriate thing to do. But I appreciate all your hard work, and I appreciate it.
Could I just mention, Mr. Miller, my staff just mentioned to me, not only is it not banned, not only is the research not banned, but there's actually a section in the bill that provides for the research and the process for it.
Right. And I appreciate that.
But new safer chemicals are banned from coming into the market for 5 years under the bill as written.
But there's a research component for those.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Shillelagh.
Mr. Shimkus, normally I'd be very protective of an agency, and I don't like the idea of Congress, dictating to an agency. But in this case, the regulators have repeatedly demonstrated that they're anti-science, that they've curbed scientists, they've recklessly been dealing with the integrity of the EPA. So I'm very wary about the EPA because of its reputation in relationship to scientists. But given that, there is a lot of scientific evidence in this area. And I really think, like my colleague, my assumption is there's going to be some kind of a compromise somewhere down the line. But I think that this bill, the way it's drafted with all the amendments, is worth going forward with. But my concern is that the agency itself that we're talking about has lost its reputation in terms of the rigor of the science, in large part because of what it has done with scientific evidence over and over again, including refusing to believe its own scientific panels. And I think that this is a nonpartisan issue because unless these great scientific agencies are respected and listened to, it simply is very difficult for Americans to have any kind of faith in decisions that come out of government. So I'm prepared to vote for the bill, even though in general I don't like the idea of mandating an agency to take steps. Thank you.
Mr. Desagne? I think everybody's asked questions, so there's no other questions. Thank you very much for being here. You are free to go. So,
Thank you.
yeah, we have an additional witness here. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Balderson. Anything that you brought in writing will, without objection, be entered into the record, and we welcome you here. And that's okay. You can fight out in the hallway, though.
It's a friendly fight.
Yeah. Welcome. Is your mic on, just to make sure?
Not.
There you
it
go.
is now.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to come forth and offer an amendment. Ranking Member Cole and members of the committee, I'm here tonight to offer an amendment to H.R. 535, which would require the EPA administrator to certify Congress that the agency has completed its PFAS action plan before the underlying bill may be implemented. First used in the 1940s, PFAS are synthetic chemicals used in a variety of products, both commercial and industrial. The U.S. military also relies heavily on the use of PFAS. They can be found in countless everyday objects, such as pizza boxes, food wrappers, nonstick cookware, stain-resistant furniture, water-resistant clothes, and firefighters' protective suits, among others. PFAS can be found in this very room, like the plastic cover on the staplers, the rubber soles of the shoes, the carpet underneath our feet, or the umbrellas being used for tonight's weather. In my Central Ohio district, where manufacturing is the pillar of our economy, many industries use PFAS in their products. Our region is also home to the Columbus Airport, which has special firefighting foam containing PFAS on hand to put out any fuel blazes. Right now, I want to focus on one critical use of these substances, medical devices. We are here tonight to discuss how to make America safer and promote public health by better regulating PFAS. Yet, we are ignoring the important role these substances play in healthcare and the well-being of patients. PFAS materials are often central components of medical devices because of their biocompatibility and durability. They are used in life-saving applications such as heart patches and grafts, stents, and surgical mesh. They are found in catheters and other medical tubing, guide wires, and sterile coatings like those on hospital gowns and masks. These substances are necessary to fight infections in hospital settings. I agree with the authors of this bill that we must be cautious with the use of chemicals and reduce the levels in our water supplies. But I believe there is a better way to accomplish this goal than to automatically list PFAS as hazardous, thereby risking public safety in another way through jeopardy to medical devices. That's why I was thrilled to learn that in response to greater awareness of this issue and rising public health concerns, the EPA announced the PFAS Action Plan. As part of this plan, the EPA works with federal, state, and local partners to understand and act on known PFAS dangers. The EPA's PFAS Action Plan is a comprehensive, cross-agency approach. This plan includes concrete steps to monitor, detect, and address PFAS contamination. One of the major steps worth noting is the EPA's December 3rd proposal for the maximum contaminant level. This important step toward public safety is currently under interagency review. For the well-being of Americans, we should support this plan's success. The administration has demonstrated that one of its top priorities is the research and necessary regulation of PFAS. Our federal government should maintain its key role in researching PFAS, which is why I've supported EPA, CDC, and other agencies' research in this matter. Further, the EPA is an appropriate agency to regulate PFAS. In order to be mindful of taxpayer dollars, Congress should allow the EPA to complete its work before casting such a wide net when labeling 5,000+ PFAS as hazardous. This is an opportunity for Congress to be proactive rather than reactive by supporting thoughtful action that ensures the safety of the American public and our environment. I invite you to join me in supporting my amendment, and I'm happy to answer any questions at this time. And Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming and testifying. I think your amendment is pretty straightforward. I don't have any questions. Mr. Hastings?
I don't have any questions, Mr. Chairman. I thank Mr. Boston for being here.
Any questions on our side of the, Mr. Perlmutter?
Yeah, I just want to thank you. That's very good testimony. Now, I think Mr. Morelli put it just right. So do we decide that these things are positive and safe? That's our default, or is our default that they're not safe? And I think the problem that, I'm layman, I'm hearing this for the first time, I don't have chemical plants in my district, is that they last forever. I mean, even uranium doesn't last forever. So that's kind of the dilemma that I face, just being an observer on this subject. So, but I appreciate your testimony. I thought it was very good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Questions on this side? Well, thank you very much. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other, wish to tell, Dr. Burgess, you want to testify? Okay.
So I also have an amendment to 535.
Go ahead.
striking Section 2 of the proposed bill. And that's the section that requires the EPA to designate PFOA and PFOS as a hazardous substance under the Superfund law. It requires that within 1 year and requires a review of the over 7,800 chemicals in the PFAS chemical group within 5 years. The EPA is undergoing a thorough review of PFAS, and Section 2 of this bill undercuts the regulatory process. This designation should be left to the regulatory process, including public notice, input, and a full scientific review and analysis. In addition, removing Section 2 would decrease direct spending by $300 million over 10 years. And I would ask this amendment be made in order.
All right, I thank the gentleman. Any questions? Thank you very much. I think, anybody else wishing to testify? I guess that's it. That will close the hearing portion of this bill. Before I do that, I want to, without objection, I'd like to submit for the record statements from Representative Houlihan, Representative Eddie Bernice Johnson in support of their amendments for this bill. And without objection, the committee stands in recess for 5 minutes. We're almost done. So with that, we'll just sit here for 5 minutes.
which is the,
The committee will come to order. At this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentleman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 535, the PFAS Action Act of 2019, a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate on the bill, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 116-45, modified by the amendment printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule makes in order only those further amendments printed in Part B, the Rules Committee report accompanying the resolution. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part B of the report. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
On this bill, we're making in order 11 Democratic amendments, 6 bipartisan amendments, and 5 Republican amendments. I'm pleased, in particular, to be making in order both amendments submitted by my Republican colleagues on the Rules Committee because you're such great colleagues. And we even put you guys first in the amendment order. So you've heard the motion from the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania. Is there any amendment or discussion? Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You've done such a good job here. I just want to take away that Republican talking point if we haven't had an open rule all year. And I actually think we're pretty close. You know, I was actually encouraged by the testimony. There's not as big a division as one might think here. And I think if we're not going to have a heavy legislative week, if we gave the whole House the opportunity to work its will, I think you could probably get to something that's pretty bipartisan.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr.
I have a real problem with Amendment 1. But I won't say any more about it.
All right, you heard the amendment for the gentleman from Oklahoma. Any debate or discussion? If not, the vote is on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say, in order, for making an order, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, do we have a roll call on that?
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings?
No.
Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? No. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? No. Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko? Aye. Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Members not agreed to. Any further amendments? Mr. Burgess, Dr. Burgess?
Yeah, I have an amendment to the rule to make an order, amendment number 39 to HR 535, offered by Mr. Shimkus of Illinois. This amendment strikes Section 2 through Section 18 of the bill and replaces it with a provision mandating the cleanup of PFOA and PFAS contamination at the Department of Defense facilities in Section 2, and a provision mandating that the EPA establish a national primary drinking water regulation for PFOA and PFAS within 2 years, as well as expedite the setting of such regulations for other PFAS chemicals that occur in Section 3.
You heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Burgess amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no? No. In your chair, the noes have it. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings? No. Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko? Aye. Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendments not agreed to. Are there further amendments? Hearing none, the vote is now on the motion from the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Mr. Cole? Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings. Aye. Mr. Hastings, aye. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Aye. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin. Aye. Mr. Raskin, aye. Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, aye. Ms. Shalala. Ms. Shalala, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier. Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, no. Mrs. Lesko. Mrs. Lesko, no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk report the total.
9 yeas, 4 nays.
The motion is agreed to. And Ms. Scanlon will handle it for the Democrats. Mr. Hastings.
Mr. Chairman, well, what's the rest of the schedule for the week?
That's a good question, and I don't know. So I think, I think we're going to be dealing with a War Powers resolution of some sort, but we haven't seen the text of it yet, and so my anticipation is that we'll probably meet tomorrow, but as soon as I get confirmation, I will let everybody know.
Thank you, sir.
Anybody else have anything they want to add? Without objection, the committee is adjourned.